Welcome back to the Innovative Agency, everybody. Sharon Toerek here with you again today. And every once in a while, I get a chance to sit down and have a conversation with somebody who I feel like I know a little bit because I've been following their content for a while, but we just have never had a chance to chat one to one. And so I'm super excited that today's one of those days. Dan Englander is somebody whose content I have really respected for quite a while now, and who I know most of you probably have had a chance to either hear from on LinkedIn or via his podcast. But Dan is CEO and founder of Sales Schema, and I'm sure you'll tell your story better than I will, Dan, but they help folks who are running and leading agencies, just like all of you do business development and sales better and to greater scale or greater impact. And I'm really excited about having the chance to have a conversation with you today, Dan. I got a lot of things I want to ask your opinion about. And so thanks for making time for being with
Thank you for
me.
having me, Sharon. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Um, so before we hit record today, I shared with you that you had put some thought leadership out recently about what is different as we're sitting here in the middle of 2025, which is when we're having this conversation about sales and business development for independent agencies. And I'm really intrigued about how what you're seeing out in the market and how you feel like business development has changed, or what the table stakes are, to use your term, now that they that might not have been table stakes, but might have only been nice to haves a couple of years ago. So I think that setting that framework, I'm super curious always to hear our guest perspective on mindset, agency owner mindset. And I'd love to start there. The headwinds right now are really tricky for agency owners. They're economic, they're social, they are technology driven, and it's a very confusing time to run and grow an agency, in my opinion, counseling agencies right now. And so let's start there. What are you seeing, and what are you observing as you talk to agency owners about their headspace in leading their organizations?
Yeah, for sure. So I think in terms of headspace, there's lots of hand-wringing, there's lots of like confusion and uncertainty. And I think a lot of it, we can look at macro stuff and climate change and, tariffs and all these different things. And it's really kind of I think the problems would still exist even if things were rosier from a macro perspective because we just have more options than ever. There's a lot of places that you can take any sort of business, but if you have a company that makes physical widgets or does any number of things, there's probably fewer options than if you have an agency that is basically just, an internet, people that have an internet connection that perform a service.
Mhm.
So I think that's both a blessing and a curse, right? Because you can really do anything you want and go in a million different directions, which creates a lot of anxiety, right? Because it's like there's a lot of levers that an agency owner can pull at any given time.
Mhm.
So I think to answer your question, I think the thing informing it is partially that. I also think it's partially this dynamic that others and myself have called the trust recession, where we're in, this situation where this scarce resource is no longer information. It's really trust, right? And
Mhm.
that's because information is really abundant. You can find out a lot about any given thing you would want to invest in or learn about very easily. And this kind of informs our little like neck of the woods, our little niche of B2B sales outreach, because 99% of what we see agencies and others doing that doesn't work is often kind of implicitly assuming that information is the scarce resource. When really it's trust, and I think it's even a bigger deal for agencies because the benefit is not realized of what they do until like weeks, months, or years after a
Mhm.
client has purchased, versus like a tech widget or something is realized immediately. So that's the foundation of it. I can get it. Yeah, I can get into table stakes and stuff, but I want to make sure I didn't lose your question.
No, yeah, you are. You're definitely going in a direction I think will be helpful for people who are listening. So trust being as critical as it is, and our attention-based economy being what it is, you kind of have the point of view, which I'd love for you to dig into a little bit about um, how and why specialization is table stakes in 2025 for agencies. And look, I know that a lot of folks listening to this right now have heard this from a million different experts in the agency world. Specialization is important, specialization is necessary, and yet we do see some of the larger independent agencies who take a really firm position that they refuse to specialize. They think it inhibits their creativity. They don't want to go there. Um, I have a firm point of view on specialization, obviously, or I wouldn't be, interviewing you on a podcast that is for agencies and agency owners and leaders. But I really want to hear from somebody like you who focuses on helping agencies sell more of what they do and develop their business better about the importance of specialization and why it's table stakes now, not just important or nice to have like it was maybe a couple years ago.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've kind of gone through different points of view on specialization. I don't think it necessarily has to be verticalization, although I think that's often the easiest and most accessible way to
Mhm.
specialize. Like you could specialize by service, right? If you're doing something that's very specific, like if you're developing internal communication programs for large organizations, like that's not necessarily by vertical, but it's a company has to be big enough to have that need. And then there's other examples of that. You might have several similar verticals that have similar problems. Like we work with agencies and related B2B service companies because they have the same problems. They both check certain boxes that we can help with, small TAMs, etc. So I don't think it has to be as narrow as verticalizing, but to answer your question, I mean, if you're thinking about specialization, I don't think it's a new thing. I don't think it's a new dynamic at all. I think it's almost like a scientific building block, right? Like we've always heard, and this is from Charlie Munger, I think I originally heard this observation, but like you think about survival of the fittest and these like Darwinian capitalist concepts, and you think of like a lion hunting a gazelle and all this stuff, and like there's a place for that. But the other natural element where like the economy and the natural environment are similar is specialization. Like if you think about like a rainforest, there's bugs that eat certain grass, and then there's, and onwards and upwards into the canopy. And like watch a David Attenborough documentary, and like the environment focuses, it essentially survives rather based on
Mm,
specialization. And then same with like any great company. Like if you think about the smartest people on earth that are starting companies with, whatever, Stanford grads in Silicon Valley that are starting the next billion-dollar business, they're starting based on specialization. They're thinking about TAM times ARPU, which is annualized revenue per user, equals 100 million or more, equals I'm going to go for this particular problem and solve it. So I'm not saying that every agency needs to become like a startup in every single way, or that every agency should want to make 100 million, but there is kind of a natural order to these things. And the idea that you're going to be the exception, I think, is unlikely. Now, of course, there are going to be exceptions sometimes. Like, I think when you look at that giant holding company, they're kind of surviving on ancient rivers of money, would be like the that I heard from this writer named Venkat Rao that I love. He like likened the economy to these ancient rivers of money. And it's like it's a little bit like that, right? Because it's like there's a lot of risk aversion, and there's kind of these old contracts and these old ways of doing things. And it's like you hire McCann, you're not going to get fired, maybe. Although I think
mhm.
that's probably changing. Like I don't want to get sued by McCann, but it's an example.
Yeah.
So those are all reasons to specialize. And I think that the reason it doesn't happen is fear. I think it's you're making a bet, and you're making a bet that is going to play out in months and even years, right? And that's going to be hard and scary for a lot of people. But I think by not doing it, you're also making a bet, and you're also taking on risk. And entrepreneurship is making bets and taking risk. So anyway, I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I feel like I'm hearing you say is that the for most independent agencies that are small or mid in size, um, there's risks to either approach. And that if you're a betting person, the risks of the lack of focus, of non-specialization over time are greater. Um, and so you have to make either decision requires bravery, right?
Yeah.
By the agency owner. And for most small agencies who aren't McCann or who aren't, who don't have a holding company structure and the money that that implies to experiment with serving everybody, in all kinds of ways, that you need to pick a focus.
Yeah, and I remember the other part of your question is why does it matter now? And I think this ties back to the trust recession, right? Because it's like if you say you can solve a particular problem, but you're not sufficiently specialized, your people aren't going to believe you, and the disbelief is going to play out in weird little places that blow up your deal, right? It's like it can play out in very innocuous places. For example, we work with agencies. We worked with agencies for 10 years. I'm still learning new things about agencies. They're changing. There's already like enough on my plate just dealing with one particular use case where if
Mhm.
I sold to enterprise tech companies, is there overlap? Do they have some of the same problems? Yes. But I'm now going to be using different terminology than they use. Like you probably like if you're an agency owner, you probably have 10 emails in your inbox right now that say somebody's saying I can get you 100 leads this week. It's like you don't want 100 leads. You don't even know what you would do with that. And plus you don't believe them anyway. You want like 3 or 5 good appointments per week with the right people. Right?
Yeah.
That's what you want. So it's like I know that because I've been in the agency space for a while. So that dynamic that I'm up against, every agency owner is up against too with their respective verticals. And if you don't come correct, then people are just increasingly more skeptical and increasingly willing to just ignore whatever it is, your ad, outreach, et cetera. Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, you're talking about the trust recession, but really, isn't it more so a credibility recession? Because even if
Yeah.
somebody who had a trusted name showed up in my inbox, if they're not coming correctly, as you
Yeah.
indicated, they're not going to be credible to me. They might be selling something that somebody needs, but it's not me. But therefore, they don't present with the same credibility to me that they.
Yeah. Exactly. Sorry to make a I was just going to say, a lot of the times with the outreach we're helping clients with, it plays out more subtly, and we have this concept called show, don't tell, right? So
Mhm.
if I'm drafting a piece of outreach, the classic sales message you see is we helped this client get 100x return on their investment, or we've helped this many clients get this massive outcome. Versus like when I do outreach, I can say, I host the Digital Agency Growth Podcast, going strong for nearly 300 episodes. And it's like, that's not beating people over the head with it. It's a very difficult thing to lie about. People may have heard of it, and it shows that you have authority in our niche in this case. So
Mhm.
if you're an agency, I'm not saying go start a podcast, but what is that version of it for you? Like for example, we have a lot of agencies that are going to conferences and trade shows all the time.
Mhm.
So just being able to say we've got a booth at this conference or I'm going to be attending this conference says,
Mhm.
oh, this person's in my world. Like
Mhm.
they're more likely to understand my problems versus some classic marketing style tagline or
Right.
brag. Yeah.
Right. And that leads me sort of to one of the other table stakes that you have, um, shared some insight around, and that is the table stakes of perspective. So we
Yeah.
talked about the table stakes of specialization, but talk a little bit about your point of view around perspective and why agencies demonstrating it is so important right now, in the environment that they're selling in.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's very important because the line between deciding what a client should do and then actually doing it is getting thinner and thinner, right? Because you have, even before AI, even before this onslaught of AI, you have more competition from an increasingly globalized workforce. You have more indirect and direct solutions, whether they're software or agencies, contractors, whatever. And now
Mhm.
you have AI that's just like increasing that.
Yeah.
So deciding what somebody should do and making a plan and then actually getting it done, the line's getting very thin between them, which is why, people like Greg Hickman and Alt Agency are successful because there's a lot of like, well, I'm going to show you how to do this as opposed to just doing it for you. But even if that's not you, being able to come up with that plan and have that perspective is becoming just as valuable, if not more valuable, which I think creates a massive opportunity for agencies. And I think that's why I'm still really bullish on the agency space.
Mhm.
But anyway, I think that, because that's the reason for perspective. But I think these things work hand in hand. So like the foundation of it is specialization, because if you're not specialized, you're not going to get clean enough data to develop your perspective on what things are.
Mm.
And when you see
Good
this, when
point.
you
I
see,
never thought
yeah,
about that. Yeah, that's a great point.
right. And it's going to be a process. It's not like you're just going to land on that niche and it's going to work. And, you know, like there's going to be two steps forward, one step back, I think a lot of the time, at least that's what I've experienced. But a lot of the times when agencies haven't nailed perspective, that's when you see the kind of hand wavy generalities that really don't convince anybody of anything and sound special to the agency, but aren't that compelling. I think when you think about perspective, it's almost like the way, like in an investor's thesis of like, here's how I think about the market and where things are going. I'm not saying you're literally doing that, but it's a little bit more like that. And it may actually play out downstream of that with the offers you make, with like the way you bundle services, with the content you're putting out, with everything, you know, and it doesn't have to be just one way of doing it. Like your perspective might be, hey, most people are buying agency services this way. It's not good for you, and like you should do it this other way. And we charge differently. It might be about, hey, everybody is investing in ads in our particular niche. It's wrong for these reasons. The better starting place is this other thing. Right. And actually, like it's overinflated. Our perspective, which by the way, it's not like I woke up one morning 10 years ago and just came up with this stuff. It's been a process. Ours is that, and a lot of it's poking the bear. Ours is that like 90% of sales tactics that are out there, like on LinkedIn or whatever, are based on large total addressable markets or TAMs. They're based on people that are selling to like software companies, transactional products where trust isn't as big and also where markets are bigger. So it's not that like doing mass large campaigns are bad. It's just that like the money is in those markets. So you hear more about it, and there aren't a lot of people focusing on small TAMs, right? So like if your entire TAM could fit into a high school gymnasium, you're playing a fundamentally different game. So that's like our perspective on things, is like this is an underrepresented part of the sales space. So anyway, that's kind of it's not quite table stakes yet, but I think it's going to become table stakes very soon.
So a couple of the low-hanging opportunities that you talked about, and this is a good segue, what you just said, into this discussion, and that is your specialization informs your perspective. I kind of see how these all build on each other, and sort of a Lego set, if you will. Your specialization builds your perspective. Your perspective shows up in thought leadership. Right? So what's your point of view on how much energy, and thought, if you will, agency leaders and owners need to be putting into thought leadership in their mix of business development activities? And how do they know how to best approach it? Because I'm sure the approach is different depending on your goals and things like that. And I'm wondering what patterns you've seen there. Where do they
Yeah.
start, for example, since this is one of the low-hanging opportunities that you've talked about? Where do they start? How do they know what options to be thinking about and what might be a best match for them? Um, and then relatedly, does it need to be the owner, in your opinion, based on what you're seeing, or should they be deputizing folks in their agency to do thought leadership too?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's a few things that work there. So I think this is probably not unlike other people that have come up with similar graphics, but I think there's kind of a Venn diagram. So you're looking at how does your ICP, which is ideal client profile, how are they consuming information, right? So like if I'm selling to, let me give an example. We had a client a while back that was selling to private equity organizations, and at that time, like he's like, oh, they all just pass around white papers. That's how they like make decisions and consume
Yeah,
ideas. So I'm like, okay, well, I guess you're
it's so
making white
true.
papers.
Lawyers
Yeah.
too, by the way.
Lawyers
Yeah,
too. So I'm like,
yeah,
you're probably going to be like, whether it's white papers or not, you're in the written word
yeah.
business, basically. Like you could start a YouTube channel, maybe five of them will watch it, but probably not your best bet. So you've got to look at that a little bit. But usually, like, there's not going to be one place. There's going to be a couple of different places. So you're Venn diagramming that with really like, what do you like to do? What do you enjoy? Like, what are you going to be consistent with? I think if you're thinking of content, thought leadership, these are different ways of saying the same thing. Like, if you're thinking of it as like, I'm going to get a handful of leads in the next week, like, you're not going to last. It's, you know, marathon, not a sprint kind of thing, right? So, You got to think about, do I like writing more? Do I like systems? Do I like showing up on video and talking to people, and so on. So those are the first two considerations. Downstream of that, I think like one of the biggest wastes of energy though is starting the thing, like trying to do the thing and then having it be a tree falls in the woods for too long, because then you never get enough wins to keep going with it.
Mhm.
So this is getting a little tactical, and into our approach. So kind of like man with a hammer, grain of salt. But we like creating situations where your prospects can actually collaborate with you on the thought leadership as it being, instead of it just being something that they may or may not stumble across.
Mhm.
So podcasts like we're doing right now,
Yeah.
research, like studies. Hey, I'm doing, a survey on this concept. Would love for you to contribute to it. Limited interview series. All these things are great, and it's going to be a much easier way to create content and also build the relationships with these people,
Mhm.
than just going in cold and asking if they need agency services. And the last part of your question, can anybody but the owner do it? Yes. Are you going to be able to find and afford that person? Maybe, maybe not. Depends where you are in the stage of the
Mhm.
business. So for a
Yeah.
lot of our clients, it's the owners, and it can be fun though if you set it up the right way.
It is fun, but I think most owners and leaders of closely held agencies that are, small or mid in size, it's a bandwidth and a resource thing, and they have to make a decision about whether they want to invest in that individual personal brand building with the hope and expectation that that will bounce back onto the agency versus investing some of those resources and using that person's bandwidth in other ways, like as a salesperson or as an account servicer or whatever. Um, so it's a challenging math question, right? How do I want to invest in building, and it's complex because do I want to invest in this person building out their thought leadership in a way that will build them up, and there's also kinds of talent retention benefits to that, et cetera, et cetera. Or do I really need, to put that into maybe a commission structure that will incentivize them to sell more accounts or sell more organically? And it's hard to know, right, where to direct that resource and that spend for an agency owner when your resources are not unlimited.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a consideration. I think overall, like, and I probably do this too, but we all think too much about building this perfect future system that's infinitely scalable versus just doing the thing in the way that's most likely to work. It's like, so
That's so true.
if
That
you
is so true.
if you're an agency owner and you're the best one to do it, and there's not a person around you that you can reasonably get to do it, then go make the content that gets the leads, and like
Mhm.
later figure out how to get somebody else to do it.
Yeah.
That's it's the classic like do stuff that doesn't scale. I think you could probably broad frame that to a lot of different places, but
Yeah.
that's one of
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
Well said. One of the other low-hanging opportunities that you talk about is relationship building. And I know agency owners try to balance between well, their bias in my experience anyway, talking to them tends to be new client relationships, adding in new blood to the pipeline. And sometimes they skip over the organic opportunities. Not all of them, but so what is your point of view about how how much of your bandwidth or your resources need to be directed towards the new relationship building versus the organic opportunities with the clients that the agency is already serving?
It's a great question. We have this concept called kind of like the trust matrix, and I'll try to explain it in a way that's easy to visualize, but it's basically two axes. You have quantity on the x-axis and you have trust on the y-axis, right? So the bottom right, where you have the least, no, I'm sorry, I said it wrong. You have trust on the x, quantity on the y. So the bottom right, where you have the most trust but the lowest quantity, are going to be your existing clients.
Mhm,
Then you have, past clients, and then you have people that you've already talked to. Then you have like people in your network that you've met. Then you have leads that you share something in common with that's compelling, which is something we work with. Then you have cold leads at the very top. So you have the most quantity, but the least amount of trust. So most people are spending or most sales approaches, I should say, are over-indexing on the top left, which is least amount of trust, highest quantity people. So the
Mhm.
issue is like, yes, you should definitely put all the energy you can into getting more business from existing clients, but you're not going to be able to do that all the time. Not all clients are happy all the time, despite what people say on LinkedIn. And there's not an infinite number of them, right? So that's
Yeah.
the issue. But from there, our whole thing is like, don't jump all the way to the top left, like go up, gradually. So what that means is to get tactical, we have this methodology we call the referral engine, right? Which is like it's not unlike what people are already doing. It's basically just baking the cake in a better way. So you're putting the ingredients in a different order that works better. So what that involves is like building, account lists, search data in LinkedIn on one hand, figuring out who you know and trust and or who trusts you already. So that's going to be like maybe 2 to 10% of all your connections we found. And then you're figuring out who is connected to the people I want to meet. And then you're asking for specific referrals tastefully. So
Mhm.
it's not like super automated, but it's getting to the point of being systematized, and it takes a lot of the work out of referrals because like the reason that referrals don't work, we assume, hey, somebody didn't help us, therefore they don't trust me, they don't like our service, that whatever. Really, we're all just busy, and most referral situations are time consuming and hard because I'm like, hey, Sharon, can you introduce me to somebody I can help? Now you've
Yeah.
got to like understand what I do and write an email and do all these things versus like, hey, Sharon, here's a few people you might know. Like, would you be willing to make an intro, make it super easy and include
Yeah.
a template you can use? So I think that, I mean, I might have lost your question a little. I think that
No, you didn't.
okay. Um, I think a big thing is kind of like where to balance, how to balance your time and how to do these sort of things. The way I see it is you have inbound and outbound. Like you have your big inbound project, which is the thought leadership thing we talked about earlier, and you're making a bet. It's at least 90 days, and maybe it's whatever, an interview series, a podcast, a blog, whatever it is for you. And then you have outbound. And outbound to me is divided into two categories. You have automated and scaled, which is to people that you don't know yet, which is a little,
Mhm.
I wouldn't say it has to be completely cold, but it's colder. And then you have outbound to that's manual, where you're writing custom emails and that kind of thing. The latter is more time, but it's much higher leverage. So for that, what I do every day, every week, every day, is I'm contacting people I've talked to in the past, or I'm contacting people that can refer me into the right accounts. So it's time well spent because like even if not everyone can help me, they're at least seeing my message versus everybody that I don't know that's handled by a more automated approach.
Mhm.
So with those three food groups, that's really what like the repeatable, reliable new business system looks like is those three things. And most agencies can balance that. Yeah.
It's like you're in my brain because I was going there next. And what I was going to ask you specifically, and you already kind of started answering it, but do you have any coaching or do you have a preconceived sort of formula about the amount of resources to spend developing outbound versus inbound tactics for an agency? Like, how does an agency know? Is there a rubric or is there a formula they should be thinking about to know which is going to be the best investment of their time? Or does it just depend upon like how quickly they need results or what kind of results they need?
It's a great question. I mean, I think it's both. I don't think you can survive on just one or the other anymore,
Yeah.
right? Because it's like they feed into each other a lot, and you need, like we talked about perspective and how important that is. That's not going to come from just like journaling, at night or something. Like you're going to have to like
Your
develop
diary.
content. Yeah, because then nobody sees it. So
Yeah.
you're going to have an inbound project, and then outbound, like people think of outbound as like massive spam emails or something, but like when you hit up an old client, that's outbound. Like when you reach out to somebody, that's outbound, right? So that's always going to be part of the equation. The question is tactically, like, how are you doing it? So I think that the rubric is really more about like the type of work, and a lot of there's basically the sort of like brute force, writing custom emails, making cold calls. That's not really our thing and is more of a
Mhm.
down market play. But that kind of thing where it's like requires your manual energy, but it is high leverage. And
Mhm.
then there's the setting up campaigns. And the campaign work, I think, is more about like deep work. It's more about creativity. It's more about systems. and the other work is more about consistency.
Mhm.
So it's basically dividing that up. When in our programs, we have a pretty simple time blocking exercise for figuring out like when you're going to do the different sorts of work and then when the
Mhm.
sales calls are going to happen and that sort of thing. But really what it has to mean is like, I think Peter Thiel said this. It's like, you look around and like, do you see any salespeople? No, then you're the salesperson. So like, if you're an owner, it's really about getting as much off your plate as possible so you can be in that role for, I don't know, probably at least a year to
Yeah,
build this system and get it
I'm
going.
so
Yeah.
not a fan personally, but he's so right on so many things. It's kind of annoying, but that's
Mixed feelings as well, especially
yeah,
lately. But he says some brilliant things for better or worse. Yeah.
right, right, right. What do you think what has surprised you, if anything, about maybe the last 2 to 3 years in business development and sales for agencies? What is something that maybe is true today that you wouldn't have expected to be such a big part of the reality of growing an agency in 2025?
That's a great question. I think I think like one thing that this is I don't want it to sound overly pessimistic, but just like how much the plot has been lost because of all the noise and because of how much incentive there is to compete for attention, right? So like there's a lot of advice and there's a lot of people that are trying to make things seem as easy as possible and and easier than they've ever been when things are as hard or harder than they've ever been.
Mm,
And I think that that has surprised me because I would have thought that like maybe this is like utopian, but we would have kept building on the really great research and books that have come out, the spin selling going on to challenger sale, going on to predictable revenue, which is, I think, kind of an outdated model, but was still really good for its time. But I feel
mm.
like we've gone backwards a little bit. And I think that's probably surprised me. Um, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. No, I mean that's a wise observation. And so looking 12 to 18 months into the future, what do you think is going to change about the reality of agencies building business? Obviously AI is changing everything, but what do you think practically and day to day is going to be the biggest adjustment that an agency owner is going to need to be thinking about? Because
Yeah.
as you
Yeah.
mentioned recently, I don't remember whether it was in some of your LinkedIn content or a podcast, but you mentioned recently that, there's a definite uptick in even younger agency owners. They're not down with the next iteration of what this business might look like for them. They're either moving on or they're cashing in or whatever. And so, but for the people who want to stay in the game, and there's lots of them, what's going to be different, do you think?
Yeah, I think probably a number of things. You kind of hinted at one of them, which is that like I've always asked like, what are you looking to build? Where do you want to go? Like on our sales
Yeah.
calls with agency owners, and like it used to be we want to scale to the moon. Now it's mostly like we want to cash out in the next 1 to few years, and that's definitely weighted more towards boomers and Gen Xers that are aging out. But it's also more and more from people my age or younger, like millennials and younger.
Mhm.
So I think that that's not necessarily an indictment on the agency space, although sometimes it is. I think it's more just like there's more options than there used to be, and there's
Right.
more change. I think that's part of it. I think the other thing, which sounds negative but is actually positive, is that we're going to come out of the classic AI hype cycle a little bit, and owners are going to have to start looking at AI with rose-colored glasses off a little bit more.
Mhm.
I just did a post about this and got kind of like some, pro and con feedback on it, or agree disagree, I should say, about like another Charlie Munger thing. He talked about how I think it was Buffett actually got presented with this new piece of technology in one of their textile plants, and they said this is going to bring down the cost of producing textiles by massive amounts. And Buffett said his response was, "I hope this doesn't work because if it does, I'm going to have to close the factory." Because what Buffett realized was that the gains from new technology are not always realized by the suppliers. Like
Mhm.
just because you have savings from a new technology doesn't mean it flows everywhere. It might flow to one particular place.
Right.
So that, you know where I'm going with this, like that doesn't mean that that's the case for all agencies, for all use cases for AI, but it could be for lots of them. So that doesn't mean that like there isn't a lot of opportunity to be had and that, AI is just a, negative in all ways. but I think it's to be looked at soberly, and I think you're going to see more agencies figuring out like really where the benefit lives and where it doesn't, and where it's hype and so on.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also in broadening their idea of what the role of a marketing services firm actually can be. And maybe some of them will evolve into the consultancies that they should be now, which is actually marketing their ideation, their ability to ideate and create and strategize versus the business model of getting paid to make stuff. Um,
Yeah.
this may be one of the factors that just completely kicks them off that hamster wheel, which needed to happen anyway because it wasn't that profitable for them in the first place. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know.
I I think you hinted at something really interesting, which is like, there's some semantics, there's like what separates an agency from a consultancy, but I sort of see a consultancy as like having more of a mode, owning, IP maybe, like which is something you help people with, having more sort of like more of a unique selling proposition, having more leverage in that way. And I think agencies are going to move more towards that model. And if you kind of look at like the biggest, B2B service companies on earth, like more recently, there's a lot more consultancies than there are agencies. Like the ginormous agencies, back to the rivers of money thing, they kind of survived back when from leverage they got when media was very consolidated, right? And they would get this like pool of clients and be like, hey, we've got this leverage. We can go to the broadcasters and get better deals on ads. And then
Mhm.
the ad revenue would pay for all the fun stuff that we associate with creative agencies, right?
Right.
So it's like those days are long gone. But we still kind of have like the remnants of that legacy, I
Mhm.
guess. Yeah.
For sure. For sure. Well, I could spend hours talking with you about the IP angle and also about media practices in the agency world, but we both have day jobs. And so I want to say this has been such a fascinating conversation. And I think there's been such great nuggets here for agency owners who are looking to think differently about where their opportunities lie. And to that end, first of all, thank you so much for sharing time with me. And secondly, you put out a lot of great content. Some of it's on some of the social platforms, some of it's on your own platform. So let's tell everybody where the best places to find out more about you, your content, and sales schema are.
For sure. And I tend to get very lofty and philosophical for better or worse. So like the thing we're actually helping people with is to set up these new business systems,
Yeah.
either through training or through building them for agencies and training them how to run them. So that's typically on outbound, and we're using referrals and commonalities and keeping it tasteful. So that's what we're actually doing. Best place to go is saleschema.com. And I have a book, this one, Relationship Sales at Scale, which is all about that. That's just saleschema.com/book. And really appreciate it, Sharon.
Awesome. And check out Dan's podcast, the name of which is
The Digital Agency Growth Podcast. Very
Got It.
original, right?
Is right. That's right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It was a great conversation. Thank you to our guest, Dan Englander, and we will see you all on the next episode. Everybody stay well until then.